Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee, e'en though it be a cross that raiseth me, still all my songs shall be nearer, my God, to thee, nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee.
I suppose anyone that desires to have a relationship with God would always be crying out that they want to be nearer to him. Well, we've been discussing heartfelt religion, and that really boils down to what do we need to do in order to be nearer to God. So join me as we continue to discuss that today. We started in John 4 last time. We want to continue there and flesh that out some today. Say it with me, Psalm 118, verse 24. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Remember Hebrews 3 and verse 13, but exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Well, in regard to heartfelt religion, we want to think specifically from John 4 today about Jesus' statement down about verse 20, where he says that worship is to be in spirit and truth. Now, you'll remember from our last study that we were talking about Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. And during the course of that conversation, Jesus told her that worship was something that she had a wrong idea about. In fact, I think Jew and Gentile alike had a wrong idea about this, because the Samaritans believed that on Mount Gerizim was the place where a person was supposed to worship. The Jews believed in Jerusalem was a place where you were supposed to worship God. And Jesus told them, you're both putting emphasis on the wrong place. And so he begins a discussion of what true religion, what real worshipers need to be concerned about. So we're going to go back over there to John chapter 4 and take a look at that. Join me there. In John 4, let's go to verse 20. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. This is what the woman says to Jesus. Jesus says to her in verse 21, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain, Mount Gerizim, nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. That doesn't sound like it's optional, does it? Well, it's not. Jesus says that true worshipers must worship in spirit and truth. So there's no option at all. If we want to be a true worshiper, that's how we have to worship. Barnes, in his commentary in regard to this idea of worshiping in spirit, makes the comments that the word spirit here stands opposed to rites and ceremonies, to the pomp of external worship. refers to the mind, the soul, the heart. They shall worship God with a sincere mind, with the simple offering of gratitude and prayer, with a desire to glorify Him, and without external pomp and splendor. Spiritual worship is that where the heart is offered to God and where we do not depend on external forms for acceptance. End quote. And I think that we learn a lot from his comments there. In spirit has to do with our whole being. There's a statement of Jesus that I want you to think about that's found over in Matthew chapter 22. And let's begin in verse 37, where Jesus is speaking here to a lawyer. A lawyer asked him a question. It says, not sincerely, but as many that were trying to trip Jesus up, who were sort of, they were enemies of Jesus, and they were sort of using subterfuge to find a way to trip him up. It says that he asked him a question, testing him. And he said, "Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?" And, Jesus could use even people who were insincere as teaching moments. And he did that here. So in Matthew 22 and verse 37, Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." That's the answer to which is the great commandment in the law. And then he says, "This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." I think that's so neat, because here's a guy who's not sincere. Here's a guy who is really trying to trip Jesus up and to put the whammy on this great progress that Jesus is making. Jesus just uses it for another opportunity to tell the truth, to spread the word, and to show people that this is what's true. This is what's real. And loving the Lord God, he says there, how? With all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is a quote that Jesus takes from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength," is the way it reads there. Jesus uses the phrase "with all your mind." And I think it's in Mark's account. He says heart, soul, mind, and strength. So all of those are included. And I think we get the idea, don't we, to worship God in spirit means to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind. It means to worship, to give to God all of our heart and soul and mind. The worship of God is not a frivolous thing to be taken lightly. It's why Paul warned the Corinthians in one particular aspect of worship that they'd better be very, very careful, because did you know that there's some cases where it's better not to worship God? Now, that may sound really strange to you, but the fact is there is a time that it would be better not to worship than to worship incorrectly, because if we don't worship, we can, back up, take a look at our lives, get them right, and then go and worship the right way. But if we worship in the wrong way, we stand in judgment. Look over at 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 27, where Paul talked about the Lord's Supper. He says, "Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this reason many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. Strong, strong language there. If you're going to worship, you've got to worship the correct way. Paul says, if you're going through the motions of eating the bread and drinking the cup of the Lord's Supper, and you're not doing it in a way that is worthy of the reverence and respect that is due God in that process, he says it's not worship to God, it's condemnation to me. If I'm doing that, it's condemnation to me. And he says that people were doing that at Corinth, and because of that, there were a lot of people there who he terms weak and sick, and he says many sleep, which is a euphemism for the fact that they were dead. Now, there are some people that, in interpreting that verse, say, well, these are spiritual terms. People are spiritually weak and sick, and some are even spiritually dead. But there are some, in interpreting this, that say because of spiritual weakness and sickness, that God has exacted his punishment in Corinth, and that a lot of people died there, physically died, because of their spiritual weakness and sickness. I don't know. Both of those things are very serious, but I would certainly hope that we would not die in a spiritually sick or weak condition. And Paul says the cure for this is you make sure that you examine yourself, and you eat of the bread and drink of the cup in a way that's worthy of the Lord. We can never be worthy ourselves, but we can do this in a way that's worthy of the Lord, giving him the reverence and the respect. You know, if you're eating the bread and drinking the cup, and the whole time you're thinking about, wonder what we're going to eat for lunch after this. Or the whole time you're thinking about, things are not going well for me at work, and I wonder what's going to happen on Monday. The whole time we're letting things of this world and carnal things flood our thoughts. Well, we're supposed to be just taking a moment to remember the death of Jesus and what all it means to us. We eat and drink damnation to ourselves. It must be done with all of our heart and soul and mind. Let's not offer what Jesus referred to as vain worship. You know, God doesn't have to take just anything that we throw his way and call worship. Jesus, in reference to some, in regard to their worship, he said, these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Would God look, you know, I go to church Sunday and I go through the motions of what everybody else is doing. Could God look at me and say, well, your mouth, you know, what you're saying is that's, you know, it looks like worship, but your heart's not in it. And true worshipers have to worship in spirit and truth. And so there's no spirit, there's no heart, soul, and mind involved. It's just lip service. And Jesus says that simply won't do it. It's vain. It's empty. It accomplishes nothing. I've used up all my time, but let's just quickly talk about what it means to worship in truth. And it means according to the will of God, the way that he says. In John chapter 17 and verse 17, where Jesus spent the entire chapter praying, he said there, sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. God is the object of our worship, and he tells us how he wishes to be worshiped. His word is truth. True worshipers have to worship not only with their heart, soul, and mind, with all of their being, but also in a true way. in Ecclesiastes, let's see, chapter 12 and verse 13, the preacher simply says, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." So if I think I'm just going to worship God any way that I want, that's just not going to cut it, is it? In fact, we've made reference to Cain and Abel, the fact that they both they both brought offerings to God, but Abel's was accepted, Abel and his sacrifice. Cain was rejected, Cain and his sacrifice. We could talk about Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10, that they offered incense, which God asked for. They put fire on the incense, which God asked for, but they didn't put the fire that God asked for. It was either the wrong source or the wrong time or in the wrong condition. It was profane fire, and God just simply wouldn't accept it. So if I'm going to worship, I have to worship the way God asked me to worship. That's heartfelt religion. It has nothing to do with all these things going on around me that make me feel a particular way. It's knowing in my heart that I'm giving God what God has asked for. And make no mistake, that will create feelings, and that will make us know that we are close to God. Thanks for thinking about these things. I hope that they've helped. If you think I've misrepresented anything or I haven't been clear, or you just want to talk more about it, use the comments section here on Facebook or YouTube, or use Facebook Messenger, or send us an email. There's 2 email addresses you're welcome to use, and we'll respond and talk about those things as much as you'd like. We always want to invite you to come and be a part of our worship services and our Bible classes and all the other things that we're involved in at Stone Ridge. We meet at 514 Airport Road. We're here on Sundays at 10, 11, and 6, Wednesdays at 7 p.m., and would be glad to meet with you for Bible study anytime that you'd like. Hey, until next time, if the Lord allows us to live and we have another opportunity, I hope that you have a great day. And if you're going to give God anything, make sure you give him everything.
Though like a wanderer, the sun gone down, darkness be over me, my rest a stone. Yet in my dreams I'd be